So good afternoon, Aristo.
Good morning, Ron. It is
Oh, so
4:02. Yeah.
we didn't do any preliminaries today as to what you want to do. So I'm just going to let you determine what you want to talk about. And I've been dwelling on SwissIndo day after day, and you might want to go and take a totally different direction. It's up to you.
Well, since we're doing the interview and there's both of us here, I don't think I want to take a completely different direction. At the same time, it's a touchy subject. I
Yeah.
take, there's been a lot of conflict in this and that, and understandably, it's a touchy subject because if you really think about it, all of the if you read, I mean, people in the U.S. especially, many of them abide by the Christian faith. And whenever there's a critical time, they reference the Book of Revelations, and you have a lot of indicators that may remind them of things that the Book of Revelations tends to say, or others who have read the prophecies of Nostradamus or something like that. So one man's angel is another man's devil, for example. This is this is understandable, of course. And the way I tend to approach is everything is an opportunity. Everything is an opportunity. It doesn't seem like an opportunity. We are challenged to turn it into an opportunity, to approach it as an opportunity and resource it or repurpose it as an opportunity. We speak about these and that people and authorities repurposing this and that. We cannot really grasp what that means on any level if we don't practice it ourselves in our individual lives. We have to really, and again, people kind of, and I do the same thing, I kind of tense up when somebody says I have to do something. But it's a habit, basically. It will serve us best if we approach everything in our perception as an opportunity, and if we challenge ourselves to swim without psychological life preservers. That even, if we're going to help the world, we're going to help the world. But the fear of thinking that we're going to sink while we're trying to swim or learning to swim can work against us. At the same time, that same fear is an opportunity to, of course, address the shadow, to reclaim something of ourselves, and more importantly, to transform the whole situation in one way or another. That doesn't mean that the so-called demonic somebody who we think is confronting us is going to turn into angelic somebody, or vice versa. It does mean that the flow of events is going to resonate, regardless of the presentation, in one way or another, into coherence with what we have called timeline one, or the timeline of healing. We cannot predict. You've mentioned esoteric stuff, and this has been my own issue for many years, focused as I am on communication, that it's very, very difficult to convey the meaning of esoteric dynamics to most anyone. Even
Especially
people,
if they haven't had esoteric experience in their life.
exactly. But even if they did have esoteric experience, there are many levels, and they're not vertical levels either, hierarchical. There's a spectrum. And so different people who have had esoteric experience interpret it in different ways. And our psychology of interpretation is a mix between what we get from the experience directly and our own defense mechanisms, not to the experience, but also to the world. I mean, we're constantly facing our traumas, whether we know it or not. So any interpretation of anything in our reality is always referenced next to the trauma. Our traumas are our inverse gold standard of reality assessment. And this is why it is very important to be able to become aware of the pain and to confront it and to be able to move toward a dynamic of healing it. However, we are also conditioned with addressing healing as a doctor addresses a patient. This is a different dynamic. It's not a matter of us standing back and healing something. We are the ones who are being healed. We are the healers. we are the force of healing, and we are the shadow that is causing all of the symptoms. That is a very, very difficult dynamic to address, and it is even more difficult to address it consistently. Spiritual awakening is not just enlightenment. Many people speak of the symptoms of, top of the mountain experiences or whatever, and these come and go. I've had some personal friends recently who've expressed things like that, and these are real. But these extreme, I know of nobody historically or otherwise, or even in esoteric perception, that really sustains that kind of awareness 24/7. It's usually a peak and then a withdrawal. Even at the highest level, so to speak, of incarnate esoteric experience, it goes back and forth. And you can see this in the lives of avatars, saints, and even Jesus wasn't on top of the mountain all the time.
Exactly.
And it's not meant to be that way, because you can't go to heaven or be dwell in heaven. You're going to disappear. Nobody's going to perceive you. You're going to alienate yourself, and eventually even your body will not be able to sustain itself, because that nourishment will not come to it. Heaven, in a way, is the nourisher. Earth is the sustainer and also nourisher from another feminine point of view. So all of these things are I'm speaking generally here. So if we can confront the situation in a way, as you say, outside the box, but we have to first leave our own box. Yeah.
I mean, I've had to reinterpret the things that I thought were true over and over again in my life. And in this stage, the last few years, I mean, it's a continual reinterpretation of my beliefs and of my perceptions. I mean, this whole thing with Mr. Sino has been, like it's challenging for a lot of people. It's been challenging for me, some of the things that I've been confronted with in relation to what people relate to who he is and how he sees himself and how he sees everyone else. It's stretched sometimes.
Look, it's challenging for me as well, because it's not so much, you can't just do it from an esoteric viewpoint. You have to bring in the secular. They have to merge. That's the most challenging thing. Otherwise, it'd be easy. I mean, that's why the New Agers are so high and mighty on themselves, because it's not that difficult to slip away into. But even they, and I'm generalizing, of course, I abide by, I consider a lot of those viewpoints. But even people who think and say they think esoterically are really abiding by a rationalistic projection of interpretation, of esoteric interpretation. Mythology, for example. Most mythology is an esoteric teaching. It has deep symbolism, like we talked about the Arabian Nights, and even Job was a tale of the Arabian Nights. And all of these things are esoteric teachings, the Greek myths. But people took them literally. And then because they were so unreasonable in terms of 3D experience, they passed them off as pure fantasy. So, and yet there was still a lingering tradition that, well, if you're an initiate or somebody who has had an experience that can be a touchstone to this, then you can read between the lines, go under the radar, look behind the scenes, and have a deeper understanding of the situation. The difficult thing is that many people who believe they have touched a level of esoteric experience, because everybody has but a deeper level of, I figured it out, or as much as I need to, and this is going to be my guide from here on in, I just have to follow. Well, let me tell people about esoteric experience, and many people will agree with me. 3D reality is uncertain enough, and it's considered solid. Five senses solid. Esoteric reality is fluid compared to 3D reality. There is no static form. A dragon is essentially a waveform. If you look at all of the traditions of dragons, they're all, the Eastern dragons, even the Western dragons with their wings. However, a dragon,
feathered serpents.
Exactly. And why did they call them feathered serpents? Because they weren't reptiles.
They could fly.
They could fly, but they had wings that were not bat wings, like we show demonic beings. The Chinese dragon has the horns of a stag and hair and the claws of an animal. Sphinxes are like dragons. They're similar. They're just not like waveforms. All dragons in the East and the serpents of the Americas and the Nagas of India are waveform creatures because that is how the energies move in an awakened body. Comets were also called dragons. Celestial events were known as dragons. Dragons are the guardians of manifestation, and they are waveforms. They have a quantum nature, that is their manifest nature. So the quantum nature of our own physicality is a dragon nature. We are all dragons, in a sense. Human beings, the human DNA, the way it's by all DNA. But the human DNA has wings. The rest of the DNA is the spiral, and it's more conditioned and constricted in the animals, although the animal collectives, the mind of the species, the totemic being, shall we say, that corresponds to a species of an animal, is also a dragon. Angels and dragons are not that far apart. The dichotomy is generated by religion, essentially because one clan's dragon, angels, whatever, were antagonistic to another clan's. So, you know, people, the families would have ancestral guardian spirits and this and that, and they wanted to take the territory. Since ancient times, people have used spirituality to promote secular ends. This has been unfortunately, and this has traumatized.
Control mechanisms.
Exactly. Well, the good news is that the current, the general establishment, the elites, the nobilities, the whatever they call themselves, the ones who have tried to breed the perfect being, have, for the most part, lost those abilities from what they used to be. Now, here I'm going to go into, and we know that in the West at least, because they went for technology. I mean, if they really had occult abilities to the point that they used to, they wouldn't need technology to the extent that they have it today. They would not encourage the revolutions, the constitutions, all of these things they call democracy. They would have not gone to the trouble of a matrix as they have created it, a scientific matrix, if they could breach immortality from the occult perspective, as alchemy promises and has always promised. So essentially, they paid the price of their, shall we say, sin by falling. And falling means losing their dragon powers. Now, there are dragons and there are dragons. And this is the kind of subject that I've looked into. But let me go into certain synchronistic things about SwissIndo, and not to jump to any conclusions. But for example, you've heard the term Super Semar chakra. On one hand, Semar is a deity or a powerful being on the esoteric plane, almost a trickster being, an ancestral being, especially for the island of Java. And on the other hand, the actual term Super Semar is found in history. And if anybody really has questions and wants to really research what the situation is, look at the history of Indonesia. Even Wikipedia and all of that. I researched Sukarno, just looked at there's a lot of information about it. And the president afterwards and all the things, and you can read between the lines. You can see with what you know today where the CIA was operating and where other things, how the hands were moving. And you can also get a sense of the psychology of these leaders, where their traumas lie, what their pet peeves are, and all of this, their weaknesses. So anyway, Super Semar is basically a document that was written in 1966 after they took Sukarno and locked him up. And then the next president came up, who was a general, I forget what his name was. Another S. Suharto, something like that. Maybe. And he basically gave the president this document and said, you will give all your power to me. And you agree that now, because what they did was they started killing people, the next regime basically that was pro-American, and they blamed the Communist Party for it because Sukarno was pro-Russian and he was very anti-colonial. having witnessed the oppression of the Dutch. And after World War II, the British came in, took over, and started bringing the Dutch back, which were, they started doing atrocities. So anyways, all of this was going on. And eventually, after the big dramas, they locked Sukarno up and said, you will sign this document. And there are many different versions with different wordings, but this is the document called Super Semar. And chakra means influence. It means sphere. It means circle. The circle of Super Semar. And I interpret it as the karma that has resulted from Super Semar. The vibration that's connected to it. It can't be a coincidence that Mr. Sino is using this term associated with this specific document. So it's just one of the things, pattern recognition, even if you're not esoterically oriented, pattern recognition is not exclusively a left brain or a right brain thing. You can look at a pattern analytically, you can look at it synthetically. So, whatever somebody tells us, unless we experience something of it ourselves, we really have a hard time of committing to it. And we all have different motivations of commitment. But I wanted to move into another angle here, another coincidence or synchronicity that's even more esoteric. We've talked about the great cycles and 26,000 year periods, for example. And these are not so much connected with the galactic center and all of this, as there are definite 26,000 year periods that vary, give or take so many thousand years, that have to do with the relation between the plane of the Earth, the equatorial plane of the Earth, the plane of the solar system, called the ecliptic, and the plane of the galaxy. Because the Earth wobbles, the relationship between these two planes changes. When it hits a certain maximum, you have a relationship between the radiations of the galaxy, the solar system, and the presence of the Earth that maximizes the connection between these three dynamics. And that plugs the Earth to greater energetic flows. And the Egyptians considered this the same river, the ancient river, where the soul comes into incarnation and leaves incarnation. They associated this with the Milky Way, with the energies that are connected with the galaxy. Now, where am I going with this? Essentially, we are in this equivalent of a springtime right now. And as I've said in the previous video, the springtime is still cold weather. The springtime begins like a lion and may end like a lamb as the summer comes in. But we can expect a lot of light, increased light, but the warmth and the life comes a little delayed from it. And we may experience
depending on where you are on the planet.
Where you are, but you can take the average of the northern hemisphere. That's where most people are. Take it at 45 degrees, where Paris is, for example, or New York or Washington, the cities of the matrix. So our center of balance in the matrix centers around this thing. But the point is that 26,000 years ago, we had the commencement of an ice age. And it's not really an ice age. The age has been here since 100,000 years ago. It's called the glaciation period. And that's a detail. But in any case, once this glaciation period started, it also coincided with the period that many people believe Atlantis, or this mythical continent or island or whatever of Atlantis, was flourishing. And it flourished for about the whole duration of the Ice Age. Around the time Atlantis sank, the glaciers retreated. So, you look at this myth and you say, let's look at it a little rationally instead of all the crazy stories about flying vehicles and this and that stretch our sensibilities a little bit. Let's just look at it. What's Atlantis? Atlantis is a continent-sized landmass where people were actually very advanced in relation to the time period, and where magic was flourishing, because if you think about it, every shaman on the planet would be going there. And the reason was that as the ice started advancing, there were some areas of the planet that were above water. And when you have areas like that, you have fertile plains. And if it's tropical, every super plant and fruit, flower, it's a veritable paradise. And animals and the hunting and all of this. So shamans already, there are shamans in the Pacific that can navigate between islands hundreds of miles where, only a GPS will do for a Westerner. So, they could really smell these things out, and they could communicate with each other telepathically, and they were different than they are today. They weren't isolated groups. There was a network of beings. And these shamans eventually pulled their sources and experienced each other as beings with an awakened waveform of life. And this form of life they perceived in every other animal and plant, and thus came up with a chimeric representation known as a dragon. A dragon is, and you can associate this with extraterrestrial dragons at the same time because it's all waveforms. So they said, well, this is the essence of life is in us, and now it's awakened and become conscious to the point that I identify with it. So I am not a normal peasant anymore, a human being with furs or whatever running around trying to survive. I am a dragon. I am this being with treasure. The treasure is not physical treasure in this case. It's the ability to navigate life in an almost miraculous manner compared to other people. So these dragons accumulated in Atlantis. And if you really look, there's been many theories about where Atlantis is, but most of the parts of the world, you'll have tiny areas above water. Even the Bahamas. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico was smashed and was above water at some point, but that was hundreds of millions of years ago. The Bahamas are a tiny landmass and wouldn't fit the bill. You also have most of the coasts are only just a few hundred miles. Sure, you could have had city-states along coasts, but it still doesn't fit the description in Plato's work, for example, which was based on interviews from an older Greek philosopher, Solon, from 600 BC, 200 years before Plato, based on what the Egyptian priests had from their oral traditions that dated to the time of the Sphinx, which many today say was built 12,000 years ago, basically at the same time Atlantis sank. So where was Atlantis? I'm not going to go through the theory, but you can Google something up called Sundaland. Sundaland is the landmass that existed in today's Indonesia around the time of the Ice Age, and it is the only landmass. All of the islands were one big mass. They were almost connected to Australia. Australia also was connected to New Guinea, if you look at your map. And all of Indochina, from Cambodia, Vietnam, and all of this, down through Malaysia, was one big landmass and connected with the islands down into the islands of Indonesia. And so, very likely, this was Atlantis. And in 3 great waves, scientists tell us, there were 3 floods that sank this. And that's exactly what the Egyptians said. They said, well, it didn't sink in one day. It sank in the end in one day. But there were many floods before that. Earthquakes, floods, great waves of water as the ice shelves melted. So it's now another thing. Jose Arguelles, the guy who came up with the Mayan factor, had an interesting book called Earth Ascending, which he wrote in 1984 with his first wife, with really nifty artwork where he came up with the idea of the PSI bank, which is the repository of archetypes, for example, that's connected to the Earth's ionosphere, connected to the waveforms that we see in the aurora borealis that are dragon-like. And essentially, he says that there are many waves on the planet, cycles. And one of the cycles he calls civilizational advance. If you notice, dominant civilizations move from east to west. You have dominant civilizations in China, India, then it moves to Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome. They'll basically dominate the planet where there's a big hubbub, a center. Then you have the Western Hemisphere, with colonialism and all of that. Now you're moving toward China and Asia. Japan before that, in the 80s and 90s. And so now you have an axis that is, at the time, that we have a full circle of the 26,000 year period. You're having the civilizational advance move to where Atlantis may have been, and the birthing of Atlantis, or if you consider that place Sundaland. We're talking about pattern recognition. We're not saying, well, this is the way it is, but it's interesting to see these things when you are completely uncertain. Let your heart be exposed to patterns, to the form of how things are. This is the way a manifest being most easily can get a handle on something. The conclusions, however, come from being able to notice where you're conditioned, to trigger where your fears are. I mean, if somebody says, like Pieta Morgan, for example, to mention that, I don't disagree with all of her reasoning, but she obviously panicked. She succumbed to fear, and she couldn't handle it. Her conclusions came from fear, whether they may have had validity or not. So she has an opportunity, and all those who have her viewpoint, to face that fear, to be able to digest it and see where that takes them. It may take them to a deeper understanding of why they think that way, and it may take them to a different options. It may take them to a continuation of the same options. It doesn't matter. However, that will lead to a liberation and an unbinding, because anybody who feels powerful, oh no, the Antichrist is coming, it's rational to move away from that and say, okay, look, I need some time to figure things out. But if you're constantly locked up in despair, and you know this yourself, if you come up to the conclusion of seeing the boogeyman rock and noticing that if, unless there's supernatural intervention, we're screwed, you end up in despair and you throw away what resources you already have. However, supernatural intervention can be interpreted in a whole variety of ways. That's the thing. We don't know what supernatural intervention is. It can be occurring right in front of our faces, and we may not recognize it for what it is. Because in essence, there's no such thing. It's all natural. Even, it's us and our own dynamics of interpretation. And this is where I urge again people to not take anything for granted and to question their assumptions. Here's one assumption I'd like to question before I finish up. We speak about the 1% and the 99%, and that's a certain categorization, of course. But then we take it further and say the masses, the dumb masses, the zombie masses. And of course, then we extract ourselves, of course, from those stupid masses. And we see humanity as a thing, as an amorphous, amoebic mass, which is exactly how an alienated psychopath views humanity. And then in the end, we contribute to that paradigm. We contribute to that matrix of interpretation, and we get locked in it. Because we can say we're not the masses, but they're the masses. It's like, look, man, everybody's the masses. Once you come up with that idea, no matter how arrogant you are, no matter what title you give yourself, no matter who you think you are separate from everybody, you're part of it. You can't separate yourself. So if you define it that way, you're screwing yourself and you're screwing everybody else. It's convenient. See, we're call it laziness, if you will, but I would say it's basically we're like those people whose arms and legs have fallen asleep and we're afraid to move them because of the pins and needles we're going to get. We're afraid of the dissonance. We're afraid of all of these frictional tribulations on the inside encounter whenever we're not comfortable. So we're addicted to our comfort zones, and we call that laziness, but I call it an addiction. It's conditioning as well. So if you look at somebody who says elite, and again, many people have questioned that. Why call them elite? What's this? Why not call them master? The thing is that, forget about that. Look at how we view ourselves. We are not the masses. Nobody is the masses. There's nobody is the masses. If anybody looks in the mirror, do they see the masses? Do they see an individual? They feel their own heart connected to other hearts. Maybe it's too complex a thing to consider a net of hearts or not as opposed to a mass blob of hearts. We can only think in terms of a few things at a time, so we clump all ourselves together. And what do we sacrifice in order to do that? We cannot comprehend our empowerment when we do that. And this is one of the reasons that esoteric understanding is so difficult. I've had people, discuss along these lines and work with them, and I can't get it. What are you talking about? It must be stupid. And then eventually, after throwing away a whole bunch of assumptions, they say, wow, that was so simple. Why couldn't I get it before? It just makes sense. Obviously, when you don't have all these idiot assumptions come in that promise pillows and footstools and toilet seats and here, sit down, relax, take it, don't work for your individuality, don't work for yourself. Things are different. And many people come and give us cliche meanings, archetypal meanings that are comfortable. The so-called psychopaths and the whole thing, whether they're psychopathic or not, rely on symbols more than any true mystic would. Even a magician or a true magus or a true sage or whatever doesn't rely on symbols as much as they do, because they use them, first of all, in order to sway the opinions of others, because we rely on symbols. We rely on them because they carry a comfort zone of a guarantee. Oh, look at that form, and it hits your subconscious. It bypasses your criticism and anything. And even your criticism questions itself, so it's all traumatized and hobbled and crippled. So, yes, we are a mess, but this mess is learning through all of these confrontations and uncertainties to wake itself up. Truly, we have had many false meanings, many false messiahs, and in the end, when we become independent of the notion of a messiah and recognize the dragon within ourselves, for the dragons have been visible. In the age of Atlantis, there was a dichotomy amongst dragons. The dragons split into two factions. One of them said, look, non-intervention. We need to understand what's going on. This natural process of karma is way beyond what we thought. The other said, no, we're sages, we're wise, we're this. We can control it all. We can control it and navigate it and guide it and put it onto the right path, because it's going to be fucked up unless we do. So these two things split up. One of them went for the direction of breeding, all of the things that David Icke tells us, but also from a well-meant direction on the other hand. Another went in the direction of diving into the sea of karma, into the sea of lives, into the masses of humanity, and getting lost, to emerge once again as anonymous people, as people who are working, who don't need titles, who don't need names, and who are working, and you don't know them, it doesn't mean they don't exist. And it's not a matter of faith. It's a matter of, if you really understand nature, that's how nature works. Nature works for 99 days behind the scenes before on the 100th day she pops up and we see a result. So I've been talking again over much.
Approaching 33 minutes.
Okay, that's good. Well, this has been it's a complex topic with SwissIndo, and I don't believe I respect Peter Egler's viewpoint, the way he approaches it. Basically, I don't know, he said, but I still want to examine things. This could be positive, this could be negative, this could be any. On the other hand, listen, at this point, our obligation to ourselves is to be right with ourselves. To find the truth that really represents us, and to learn not to be fooled again. Not because somebody is trying to fool us, but because we're still asleep. We think we're awake, we're mumbling in our sleep, we're tossing in our sleep, we're slapping ourselves in our sleep, but waking up is a relative thing. And we always like to convince ourselves that we're awake because we think in terms of either or. Perhaps next time I'd like to bring in another thing that may be a little controversial, but I've also researched the relationship of the occult, esoteric, whatever, of the East and West and their mindsets. And maybe I'll have something to say about that if something else doesn't come along. But this is an important thing because it's getting the blood flowing, if nothing else. It's getting the blood flowing in life, and blood carries oxygen no matter what. Even if, you're hyperventilating and you may carry too much carbon dioxide and pass out again. But still, anything that generates passion and triggers fear is an opportunity. Anything that challenges us to stand up and define it on our terms and to repurpose it. If you think somebody's a messiah and you're questioning that messiah, repurpose that messiah. Repurpose your relationship to that messiah in a way, because in the end, who's going to come and save whom? It's how everything is going to fit together in a way that it has never done before. That's the key. You can have paradoxical things that seem completely at odds with each other. Somebody may come, but if they don't fit with how everything else is fitting together, then something needs to be done. It may fit, everything else may alter. Everything is modifying. So it's an organic process. Nobody's in charge. Everything, and that's where the faction that said, look, man, we need to just let nature tell us, let God truly speak to us from within the process itself, instead of, just because we're on top of the mountain with a certain view, think we have all the answers. So that was the humble point of view, and it led to a lot of karmic torment. The other point of view was from a safe vantage point that led to alienation. So for the most part. So that's what I wanted to have to say today. A little bit more food for thought. Things are going to get turbulent, and that's a good thing. We want to manifest that turbulent more on the inside, even if it's in our communications. We want to pray that the energy doesn't need to go into 3 dimensions, because we're taking responsibility for it right here. The 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th, 10th dimensions are right here. And we're at the center of it. Every individual is at the center of the universe. Nobody is part of any masses of anything. Thank you very much for
Aristo,
listening once again.
Have a good week, and namaste.